An entire civilization was wiped from the face of the earth. Then, at the dawn of the 20th century, the remains of a spectacular palace were discovered on the island of Crete. On a neighboring Greek island, a town was unearthed, preserved beneath thousands of tons of volcanic ash. Teams of investigators are examining every fragment from these mysterious sites to decipher their hidden secrets. And out of the physical clues lifted from the ash, a radical theory has emerged. These ruins could be the home of an ancient civilization, Atlantis. Using cutting-edge visual technology, we rebuild the incredible towns, temples, and palaces. We reveal the majesty and the mystery of this lost world. Every search for Atlantis begins with the writings of the great Greek philosopher Plato.
Plato was essentially the father of Western philosophy, and because what he had to say was so important and has remained important throughout the history of Western thought, it became much more acceptable, much more respectable, if you will, than if someone else had written it.
In one of the most intriguing of his writings, Plato describes a remarkable utopian society. Rich in wealth and knowledge, their skills as builders and engineers were advanced beyond imagining. But, he says, the peace of this land was suddenly torn apart. Legend has it that the entire civilization was wiped out in a single day and night, engulfed by the ocean and lost to the world for thousands of years. No other mystery on Earth has sparked such obsession or given rise to so many extraordinary theories. On the Mediterranean island of Crete, a discovery was made in early 1900 that would add a new chapter in the search for Atlantis. An archaeologist named Arthur Evans, a real-life Indiana Jones, arrived on Crete. He was searching for the treasures of the ancient world.
Evans was looking for something very specific. He was looking for the first European culture, but he was also looking for the roots to Greek mythology.
Evans began his search in a hilltop settlement called Knossos. He soon found something that was beyond his wildest dreams. In the very first trench he dug, Evans unearthed a magnificent stone throne. It was the heart of a spectacular palace complex. Covering an area the size of 4 football fields and containing 10 times as many rooms as Washington's White House, the dig exposed construction on a massive scale.
What he found was beyond all expectations of anyone at the time, and essentially he defined the civilization around it, which he called the Minoan civilization.
The name Evans chose came from a figure in ancient Greek myth called King Minos. Minos was said to live in a great palace, at the center of which he had imprisoned a terrible monster. Half man, half bull, it was called the Minotaur.
Sir Arthur Evans thought that he had found the palace of King Minos. They probably had nothing to do with King Minos, but on the other hand, it seemed like a good label, and it has stuck.
Today, a groundbreaking new theory has emerged as to the origin of this lost world.
It's entirely possible that something like the Atlantis myth comes out of here, and it's passed on for centuries and grew in some kind of grand importance. And so there is this theory that the Minoans were in fact the early Atlanteans.
It is the sophistication of the palace on Crete that is the first link to the idea of Atlantis. The builders of this remarkable structure had achieved a level of engineering excellence that would not be seen anywhere else in the world for centuries. It is littered with artifacts dating back over 3,500 years. The remains of hundreds of decorative pots and beautiful wall paintings are being discovered. As investigators piece together the fragments of this ancient art, they are discovering sophisticated images of the people and the lives of a lost civilization.
People were extremely interested because this was going back beyond the boundaries of classical studies and classical archaeology into something entirely new, which had not really been envisaged before.
The buildings here are older than anything previously discovered on the island, and they are infinitely more advanced. Teams of experts are now searching for the clues that relate this complex architecture to Plato's story of Atlantis. Colin MacDonald has scoured every inch of the palace, above and below ground, to expose every technological achievement. And beneath the surface, he has discovered one of the site's most advanced features.
Down beneath all of this, there is the most remarkable water system, both for the drainage of water and for the water supply itself.
Astoundingly, this sophisticated network of pipes predates the plumbing of the great Greek and Roman empires by over 1,000 years.
These terracotta or clay water pipes are made up of 1 meter sections, the one tapering into the other. It took water to lots of different parts of the palace, and equally impressive systems were used actually to get water out of the palace for the drainage system itself.
A vast subterranean network carried wastewater away from the palace. Using the details of Colin's survey, we can now see how the drain circled through the palace's royal quarter.
We're right in the middle of the main drainage system of the palace here on the east side. It's stone built on either side, about 1 meter high here. In times of torrential rain, huge quantities of water could be dealt with by this drainage system.
A similarly sophisticated water management system is described in Plato's stories. He wrote of a palace where water was plentiful. Collected from the surrounding hills, it was in abundant supply throughout the city, just as it was here at Knossos. What's more, at the Palace of Knossos, the engineering above ground is every bit as sophisticated as that which Plato describes. The palace contained 1,300 rooms spread over 4 floors, all interconnected by miles of passageways. It was centuries ahead of anything seen from the same era on mainland Greece.
What we had on the Greek mainland in the period of the palaces was nothing more complicated really than maximum 3 or 4 room single-story mud brick structures. There's no grand architecture on the scale that we see in the Cretan palaces.
Plato describes the Palace of Atlantis as an acropolis sitting atop a great hill. At Knossos, we find just that. Construction must have involved huge earth-moving operations. The entire hilltop was flattened and terraces were carved so that the palace could be built on multiple levels. The large foundation blocks of the palace walls were constructed of crystalline stone called gypsum. It was quarried locally and then cut into massive blocks with bronze saws.
We're right in the middle of a large quarry used for quarrying the gypsum that was used in the construction of the first palace at Knossos. Here, one can see very, very clearly the tool mark of the bronze object which sliced away an enormous part of the face, and the resulting block, which would have fallen down, would then either have been worked here or moved the 800 meters or so over to the palace itself.
In the Atlantis myth, the external walls of the great palaces were said to shine like silver. Today, the gypsum walls of Knossos have been eroded by the elements, but in their full glory, they too would have sparkled.
You can almost imagine what it felt like for a Greek coming ashore in Crete and seeing something like the glimmering gypsum palace at Knossos, this giant, shiny structure glistening in the sun from all this crystalline gypsum, and on a scale like they couldn't have even possibly imagined at that time.
A vast royal residence, a place of worship and ceremony at the center of an advanced and wealthy civilization. Using their latest evidence, our team applies state-of-the-art imaging techniques to rebuild this prehistoric palace. We can now see the structure as it would once have stood here, supported by huge redwood pillars. Many believe this was Atlantis. Now, our investigators are going deeper, to the very fabric of this extraordinary palace in search of the vital clues that might provide proof. What they find is evidence of the cause of the destruction of this lost world. In the heart of the Mediterranean Sea, on the island of Crete, a remarkably sophisticated palace has been unearthed, and the find has reignited the search for the most famous of all lost worlds. With its massive scale, its complex water management systems, and its sparkling gypsum walls, the engineering of this extraordinary palace ties it closely to Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. Hidden deep in the fabric of this amazing place, there are even more compelling links. Plato wrote of Atlantis that it was a complex society that lived a utopian existence, its people in harmony with nature and their fellow man. That same harmony can be seen here, in the order and symmetry of the building's engineering, in the way it makes use of the natural flow of the elements. The palace engineers were masters at controlling the path of air and light through the depths of the palace quarters. They devised systems that appear advanced even today, even though they are almost 4,000 years old. Internal rooms were divided with an ingenious system known as pier and door partitioning. Rows of pillars were linked by discrete wooden shutters which could be controlled independently of each other. They could be set to block the path of a cold wind or channel a breeze to the palace's innermost room. At the very heart of the palace is the central court, providing light and air to all areas of the complex. To the east is the royal quarter, a multi-story structure to rival anything described in Plato's accounts of Atlantis. At its heart, a huge 4-story spiraling staircase was built around pillared balconies, open to the elements to form a vast light well.
This impressive structure was really one of the great achievements of Minoan engineering. And in the middle of the staircase is this marvelous rectangular light well, which allowed the natural sunlight to diffuse all the way down to the bottom and then outwards into all the rooms which would otherwise have been very gloomy indeed.
This awesome technology and the sophisticated culture that created it appear to have thrived in the Mediterranean for centuries, but then they simply disappeared. Just as in the story of Atlantis, it seems this entire civilization was wiped from the face of the earth in a sudden and violent catastrophe. The first clues to what might have happened lie in the sea that surrounds the island. The whole of the Mediterranean is divided into two tectonic plates, with Europe on one side and Africa on the other. These two colossal land masses collide, and periodically the energy of these collisions is released in earthquakes.
The archaeological evidence for earthquakes is very difficult to detect here, partly because, of course, they rebuilt and repaired immediately afterwards. There is one instance, however, on the south side in the so-called House of the Fallen Blocks. It seems that at the end of the First Palace period, there was a huge earthquake, and these enormous blocks were thrown several meters to the south, and there they remain today as evidence of this enormous earthquake.
Our experts have discovered that the palace engineers devised new and innovative techniques to create structures that would withstand the destructive force of these violent quakes.
Simply put, if you...
Today, our team are keen to learn from the experience of the palace engineers, and they study closely the anti-seismic techniques deployed at Knossos.
In order to make their tall, skinny walls stand up, it's quite probable that the first thing they did was to buttress them up, rather like this. So if I pretend to be an earthquake and shake this table here, well, as we can see, buttressing on its own doesn't do the job.
In the final phase of building at the palace, walls were constructed of stone and supported by an ingenious system of wooden frames. This combination of materials gave the structure both enormous strength and flexibility.
So what the people of Knossos did was to use timber framing to reinforce their thin masonry walls and support the framed up wall off big heavy walls, buttressing like this. And if I pretend to be an earthquake machine again and give it a good old shake, we can rapidly see that I could be shaking that all day long, and this wall is going precisely nowhere.
Despite these incredible engineering achievements, nothing was going to save the palace from the devastating cataclysm to come. Seismologists that have been studying the geological history of the area now believe that Crete suffered a cataclysmic event around 1500 BC. This new evidence shows that Crete was struck by a massive and deadly wave.
Dozens of tsunamis swept across the entire Aegean. Tsunami, tsunami, tsunami. Trains of these waves.
On the Mediterranean island of Crete, archaeologists have discovered the remains of an ancient palace. These stunning buildings are the first trace of a culture that has been missing for 3,500 years, and many believe that the palace was at the heart of the most famous of all lost worlds, the civilization of Atlantis. Just like Atlantis, the palace of Knossos and the island of Crete were devastated in a cataclysmic event. In search of the source of this destruction, experts have focused on a volcanic island 100 miles north of Crete. It was known in ancient times as Thera. Today, it is Santorini. Volcanologist Floyd McCoy has made it his life's work to decipher the geological clues and piece together the island's destructive history.
This volcano has an amazing history of repeated giant explosions. With every explosion, this hole in the ground, which we call a caldera, is re-excavated repeatedly. And every time it blows itself apart, it leaves a deposit on the landscape, and layer by layer, it builds itself up. And so what we see over there are the layers of these repeated explosive eruptions through tens of thousands of years.
At the center of Santorini, inside the cliffs of the main island, is Nea Kameni, the new furnace. It is a barren and hostile island, peaked by the crater of an active volcano. Floyd McCoy has discovered that there was once an island right at the center of the caldera. It was swallowed up by a terrible volcanic eruption.
Occupying this large caldera then was this large island that a civilization lived on. It's gone. The island was blasted to bits.
Plato wrote of a devastating cataclysm that destroyed the great civilization of Atlantis. And Santorini, the closest neighbor to Crete and the Palace of Knossos, was the location of one of the biggest explosions in recorded history. Researchers have developed a new theory that Santorini and Crete were both a part of Atlantis. The theory has its basis in the dramatic color of these cliffs. Plato described quarries in Atlantis where rocks of white, black, and red were extracted from the hills. The rock was then used in the construction of a great island city. The description matches the rocks found here in Santorini. This island city was described as being laid out in a series of concentric circles of land and water, each one connected to the ocean by an immense canal 100 feet deep.
There were also docks for huge numbers of ships and a causeway over which they could offload the riches, whatever they were, that were coming into Atlantis. In other words, everything that human beings could need was available in Atlantis itself.
Plato's description of the island as circular relates perfectly to the symmetrical formation of the central volcanic island on Santorini. But to prove a link is impossible without proof of life on the island before its last big eruption. Then, in the early 1900s, during excavations in a quarry here, a fantastic discovery was made.
That layer, that white layer on top of the cliffs, is a deposit left from the catastrophic eruption in the Bronze Age. And it was digging there that they found a house site. In another case, they found a burial. They realized this eruption had buried a civilization, a culture lived there. The story then of that ancient civilization starts there with that layer of white ash.
These volcanic deposits, which still cover the entire island, fell in the course of a single cataclysmic eruption. Now our experts are stripping back the ash layer by layer to expose evidence of the lost world that lies beneath.
Here it is. This is the level that man lived on, right here. Here, in fact, is what appears to be a remnant of a wall built by man on top. And then the eruption came. The big blast started, and all of this was deposited. This is pumice, and the pumice piled up very rapidly. And then the eruption continued, 4 days of a massive accumulation of all of this material all up here, 30, 50, 60, 80 feet of this material piling up, and then way up at the top, the debris flows, the mud flows that scoured the surface. All of this, one of the giant eruptions in human history.
The first signs of life from before this big eruption had been found, and the search was on to reveal proof of a culture that would link the island to the great civilizations of Crete and Atlantis. The answer was unearthed in 1966 by an American archaeologist named James Mavor Jr. Mavor assembled a team to search the islands for signs of ancient artifacts. They began their dig on the southern tip of the island, in the tiny village of Akrotiri. In their very first trench, they struck gold. They unearthed an ancient wall buried under 30 feet of volcanic rock. As they dug deeper, the wall became a house, and the trench revealed a cobbled street. At their very first attempt, Mavor's team had discovered an extraordinary town, perfectly preserved in the ash of a volcanic eruption.
We are talking about a brilliant culture, brilliant civilization, with very advanced technology in all ways, and especially building technology.
The discovery was hailed as one of the most important finds in classical archaeology. The town remained substantially intact. Just like the city of Pompeii in Italy, volcanic ash had filled the city and sealed it from the elements. Its contents had been preserved for more than 30 centuries. The huge task of uncovering the town continues today. With every inch of ash that is removed, new clues to the civilization that was here are revealed. And just as described in the legend of Atlantis, we see engineering skills that were sophisticated way beyond their time.
When I first came to Akrotiri, I was expecting something rather simple. But then I realized that this town was made of multi-story buildings. And when we are talking about multi-story, we are talking about 2- and 3-story buildings. And at some point, I realized that I was walking on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed 3,500 years ago. That was really extremely impressive.
Akrotiri is a truly extraordinary find. It is a city arranged with a structured assembly of interconnecting roads and paths, the earliest form of organized town planning ever discovered, and centuries more advanced than anything that has ever been seen before from this period. Archaeologists have mapped every inch of the town, and from their data, our team have built computer-generated models. You are now traveling down the streets and interacting with the buildings of a sophisticated community that was destroyed at the height of its power thousands of years ago. Just as we have seen in the Palace of Knossos, at Akrotiri there are complex multi-story buildings constructed of wood and stone. And the plumbing was even more elaborate. Fresh running water fed each house, and a sewerage system ran throughout the entire town.
There is a perfect sewage system running under the streets, and these are connected to lavatories on the upper floors of the buildings.
Not for at least 1,000 years would it become commonplace to find bathrooms inside people's homes.
The discovery of this lavatory, as you can imagine, is truly very important. If you just stop to think, it took ages, hundreds of years to have lavatories within a house.
It was not just the discovery of a toilet that so amazed the engineers, but also its ingenious design. The waste fell through a clay pipe to a chamber below, where water from the town drains flushed it into a cesspit. The pipes interconnected in such a way that a siphon effect was formed, drawing foul smells down the pipes and away from the lavatory. The design was centuries ahead of its time. This sophisticated system of water management matches up to the stories of Atlantis, in which Plato wrote of ancient towns equipped with hot and cold running water. But there was one crucial discovery at Akrotiri that lent new credibility to the idea that Santorini was the island at the center of Atlantis. A fresco was unearthed that revealed an image of life on the island 3,500 years ago.
Can we be so lucky as to have a snapshot of what this landscape looked like? Here is the peninsula, the Akrotiri Peninsula. It shows a profile of the island, 1, 2, 3 peaks. Going down farther, we see a waterway that surrounds a central island, a fairly large island. And on that island, a city. They were living on the central island. That central island was a developing volcano.
This idea of a central island port, encircled with layer upon layer of buildings, fits perfectly Plato's description of the island city of Atlantis. A city that at the height of its power was blown to bits in a devastating eruption. Seismologists are now following a trail of clues that lead from Santorini back to the palaces of Crete. They will reveal the full extent of the horrific disaster that tore Santorini apart and led to the destruction of an entire civilization. In the heart of the Mediterranean, a lost world has been discovered. A palace on Crete and a town on Santorini, linked by the unique engineering of their buildings. Archaeologists have opened a window on a highly advanced culture known today as the Minoans. They thrived 3,500 years ago, and many now believe that what they left behind gave rise to the myth of Atlantis. Since the discovery of the palace at Knossos in 1900, archaeologists have expanded their search. Today, a network of ancient towns and palaces has been revealed across the length and breadth of Crete. What all these sites have in common is that they were destroyed in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC by a series of terrible disasters. According to the Greek philosopher Plato, Atlantis too was destroyed in a single day and night. The land was swallowed by the sea. 100 miles north of Crete on Santorini, Floyd McCoy has been gathering data to determine if the magnitude of the eruption that happened here in 1500 BC was enough to cause the devastation of Crete. What he has discovered is beyond all expectations.
So how big was this eruption? It was huge. How do we determine this is by how much material is blown out during the eruption. And the more we look, the more we find. There are huge, thick deposits of this ash and pumice on the seafloor that surround this island. It's been found down to the Nile Delta. It's been found up in the Black Sea. When we take all of this material and calculate the volume of it, we come out with an eruption that is perhaps 10 times Krakatoa in 1883.
Because Krakatoa exploded in the late 19th century, we have comprehensive records of the eruption, and the details are spine-chilling. The eruption ejected more than 6 cubic miles of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere, killing 36,400 people. But it would have been dwarfed by the Santorini eruption.
It was enormous, and it occurred right in the middle of a flourishing civilization. Now things got nasty. In this eruption, things got terribly violent, and the mixture of water with this magma produced what we call pyroclastic surges and flows. As they swept across the landscape, they destroyed everything that had not been buried in this pumice.
At the heart of this civilization in Akrotiri, archaeologists have found signs that the residents were preparing to leave. Belongings were piled up outside houses, and beds were found pulled out into the streets. Sadly, for the few who took to the sea to head for Crete and the shelter of the palaces of Knossos, escape was no guarantee of survival. Because the settlements of Crete would be devastated, not by the ash and pumice that was raining down on Santorini, but by the next, even more devastating phase of the eruption.
Every pyroclastic flow that entered the ocean also pushed the ocean aside. When you push the ocean aside, tsunami.
Our investigators have turned to the experts at the National Observatory in Athens for proof of what happened. Using the very latest investigative techniques, they have discovered evidence of a killer tsunami.
Because of this new field of science, we have been able to discover a number of about 10 distinct tsunami events. So there's no doubt today that this very big tsunami event really existed and possibly contributed to the collapse of the Minoan civilization.
Dozens of tsunamis swept across the entire Aegean. They made their way into the Mediterranean.
These massive waves surged towards the unprotected north coast of Crete. First in the firing line was the coastal town of Malea. Just yards from the seashore stood a magnificent palace, its sophisticated structures engineered with the same complex layout as the palace at Knossos. The three-story facade facing north was directly in the path of the approaching waves.
The inhabitants of the region probably gathered here at the palace because they saw this great plume of ash shooting up into the sky off to the north. It would have been visible all the way down to the Nile Delta.
When the ash cloud reached the island, the sky above this ancient Minoan palace turned gray. During excavations on Crete, Alexander McGillivray discovered this volcanic ash in the deepest parts of the palace's ruins. It's a clue to the catastrophic sequence of events that overtook this society.
When the first wave came pushing ashore, bringing with it their fleet, from fishing boats to great trading ships, would have all come crashing through here and gone all the way to the foot of the mountains over there, ripping away at this architecture, rubble and trees and smashed up ships come crashing back through here and over back into the sea.
This scene of destruction was repeated all along the coast of Crete and far beyond. Not even the brilliant builders of the great reinforced walls at the Palace of Knossos could have foreseen the power of the tremors that accompanied these waves. They rocked the island. Massive earthquakes caused by the volcano shook the palace to its foundations. The devastation of this ancient civilization was complete. Today, long after the destruction that struck the Mediterranean, the search for the links that bind these places to the story of Atlantis has taken a new turn. The final extraordinary clue leads east to the ancient land of Egypt. For the survivors of the largest volcanic eruption in history, life in the Mediterranean became hell on Earth. Thousands were dead. Tsunamis had poisoned the land with salt water, and the air was thick with ash and noxious gases. Just as Plato wrote when he described the end of Atlantis, the island of Santorini, at the center of this newly discovered world, had been destroyed. It had been blown to smithereens, then swallowed by the sea. And 100 miles away, the great palaces of Crete had been devastated by quakes and engulfed by terrible tidal waves. In their search for evidence of the survivors of this devastating cataclysm, our investigators are piecing together the final chapter in the life of this extraordinary civilization.
When the tsunami swept through here and reduced this building behind me to foundation level, the best way for the survivors to cope was to go to the most powerful nation and the wealthiest nation of the time to ask for help.
Alexander McGillivray believes that the survivors turned to their long-term trading partners, the Egyptians.
There may have been people brought in from elsewhere to help with all of this, with the pharaoh in Egypt contributing the wealth and perhaps the manpower.
This close relationship with Egypt is probably the single most important link that researchers have established between this newly discovered civilization and the stories of Atlantis. Because the origin of the story of Atlantis was not Greek, it was Egyptian. In 590 BC, in the holiest shrine of Egypt's capital, the great Greek statesman Solon was shown ancient inscriptions. They date back to almost 1,000 years before, 1450 BC. These documents told of the existence of a civilization of great power and prestige, ruler of all the lands to the west of Egypt. When Solon returned to his homeland, the story of Atlantis became part of Greek folklore, a tale told at parties and passed down through the generations until, in 370 BC, Plato penned his version of this Egyptian tale. Now, on the wall of an Egyptian tomb, researchers have discovered inscriptions that they believe are the original texts that were shown to Solon. It turns out that Solon must have invented the name Atlantis because the Egyptians called the people of this ancient world by another name. That name was Kefchu, and Kefchu is the Egyptian name for the people of Crete, the very island at the heart of this lost world. So what happened to the survivors from this remarkable civilization? There are signs on Crete that the Kefchu did begin to recover after the effects of the catastrophic volcano. But the survivors were dangerously vulnerable, and soon after the catastrophe, warriors from the Greek mainland invaded Crete. The Minoans did not have the strength or the numbers to repel the invaders, and the island fell. This finally spelled the end of one of the greatest civilizations in human history. The sophisticated engineering techniques and the extraordinary architecture that gave them their unique identity disappeared forever. The Greeks went on to dominate the entire Western world. They gave birth to a culture on which Western societies are based, but things could have been so different.
If it weren't for the tsunami and the Theran eruption, we would probably be reading Plato in Minoan. The Minoans would have continued to expand their empire onto the Greek mainland. The White House would probably look more like the palace at Knossos than classical Greek architecture.
There are still many questions to be answered that could shed light on the links between the great palaces, towns, and temples of Crete and Santorini, and the mysterious legends of the Egyptians' Kefchu and Plato's Atlantis. On Santorini, vast areas wait to be excavated, and the ocean bed remains largely unexplored. But time may be running out. At the heart of the caldera, beneath the towering cliffs of the modern-day Santorini, is the Nea Kamenni, or New Furnace. It is the site of the present volcano, and it is still very much alive. When the volcano collapsed after the eruption 3,500 years ago, it left behind a hole in the ocean 1,000 feet deep. Since that time, the volcano has been growing again, pushing back up through the ocean. Today, it rises 400 feet above sea level, back almost to the size that it was when it erupted 35 centuries ago. Seismologists believe that it will erupt again. The question is when.
When that next big blast comes, the best we can do is hope that we can predict it and get away. If we don't, if we stay here for that next big explosion, we'll be a piece of the volcanic ash deposit.
When the volcano does blow, it will engulf the surrounding islands again, freezing life in a moment of time, burying it under a new layer of volcanic ash. A new lost world will be created.